Hello and welcome to INE's CCI Collaboration version 3 Learning Path. Today in this video, we will learn about setting up LDAP on our CMS, basically importing all the users from LDAP and creating core spaces. We can do this in two ways. One could be we can do this from the GUI or we could do API calls to the CMS. In this video, we would be doing it through the GUI. So let's take a quick access to our GUI and configure LDAP so that we can import all the users. So we would define the LDAP source, the LDAP information, so the mapping information, and then pull all the users from our LDAP server. The LDAP server has already been pre-configured, so even in the lab exam, you would not have to configure LDAP. You would only need to configure that on the CMS side. So let's log into our CMS using administrator. I do have access to my GUI because in the previous video we had enabled web admin, so we do have GUI access. So once I log in using the username administrator, password CCI collab, and if I go to configuration Active Directory, here is where I would set up my LDAP settings. But before I do that, let's go back to status and go to users and see if we have any users. At this point of time, I have no users. Again, if I go back to configuration and spaces, I have no spaces for any users at this point of time. So the first thing that I would do would be set up my LDAP settings. And the parameters required for the LDAP settings could be taken from the API guide, which you do have access to in the lab exam. So let's go to configuration, Active Directory, and fill these details out. So the address would be your LDAP server, which is, for me, it is hq-dns.ine.com, which is my LDAP server. The port would be 389, username would be administrator@ine.com, and the password would be CCI collab. Now, the next thing that I need is the base DN information. Now, this information should be provided to you by Cisco in case if they do ask you this in the lab exam. But in case if it's not, then you can always go back to your LDAP server and go to the properties and look at the information about the user under attributes. You should find your base DN. Let's in fact do that. What I will do is I will take a remote desktop of my Active Directory machine, and we will see the base DN information from that Active Directory machine. So I do have my machine here. Let's log in and look at any user. I think we do have some users pre-configured, maybe Bruce Banner. We look at the attribute settings of that user to find the base DN information. This takes a bit of time for this machine to log in, obviously because of resources, but it should log in anytime soon. All right, so we have a machine. Let's go to Active Directory, go to HQ, or maybe we could go and look at users. And I believe my users are in HQ, in fact, this folder. Let's just click on Bruce Banner and go to Properties and go to Attribute Editor. Here is where I should find the base DN information for this user, which you can see here. So I don't want to import just Bruce Banner, right? So I'm just going to take this part, OU equals HQ, DC equals INE, and DC equals COM. So let's go back to our CMS and put this information here. So OU equals HQ, DC equals INE, and DC equals COM. The filter would be, you should have a filter. maybe I'll put a filter as anybody who has a mail. So mail equals star. I believe only 3 users have a mail address set up on my LDAP server. So it should import 3 users. And what should be the display name of the user? Now all these fields here, this could be, you don't really have to memorize anything. We could take all this information from the documentation, which is available in the lab exam, which is here, the API guide. So to actually get this guide, what you could do in the lab exam is directly go to cisco.com/meeting server. So go to this URL and scroll all the way down. In fact, it should be cisco.com/go/meeting server. So go to this URL, scroll all the way down to technical support and go down to programming guides and open up the API reference guide. It's the first link. Once you open this, you would reach this document. Now here is where you could just search for LDAP mapping by just doing Control F and search for LDAP mapping, and you should reach this page, which basically gives you all the parameters required that you need to fill out. So what I could do is maybe have my display name as the common name. So basically my display name would be something like Bruce Banner. So let's go back here and put the display name as my common name. My username would be this information. So go back here. The username would be, obviously I'm going to change this to ini.com. So it basically becomes bruce.banner, which is my username at ini.com. What should be my space name? My space name could be again maybe I could name this as my username. And let's give it $, space. So it would look like Bruce Banner space. And the next thing that I could do is the URI. So if somebody wants to dial me through the URI, what should be my URI? Again, maybe I could use something like my name at ini.com. And do I have a secondary URI? Maybe I can have a secondary URI also, which says call. Again, this is just a name. So if somebody wants to dial me through the URI, they could dial bruce.banner at ini.com, or they could dial bruce.banner. And then the call ID, they could even in fact dial me through my extension. So let's say if somebody dials 2002, it joins Bruce Banner's meeting space. So for the space call ID, I could use something like my IP phone or my phone number, my extension. This could be IP phone $, and submit. So it says that the space name is invalid, so it probably needs a name. Maybe I could just have as join. And submit. So now I have configured the LDAP settings, the directory configuration on my CMS. Obviously, my users are still not imported at this point of time. I would need to go and configure, or in fact sync, so that it pulls the users from my LDAP server. So let's go back to Active Directory and do a sync now. Once I do a sync, it should pull all the users. However, before we verify that, let's go back to logs, event log. We should be able to see that if the sync was success. So the sync operation was finalizing, and now the sync operation is complete. If your sync is not complete, you would probably see an error here that your sync could not happen and the users were not imported. And what was the reason? Maybe let's say if you mistyped one of the JID mappings, or maybe your parameters like your username or something was incorrect, then you would probably see it here, which says that your sync was not complete. At this point of time, our sync was complete. So if I go back to status users, I should see 3 users. I have Bruce Banner, Flash, and Tony Stark. These 3 users have been imported because they had an email address, because my filter was mail. So they had an email address. So these 3 users were pulled out. And if I look back at configuration, spaces was automatically created for these 3 users. So my space name is bruce.banner space. My URI part is bruce.banner join or bruce.banner call. And my call ID is my phone number, which is my 2002, 2003, and 2004 respectively. So with this, we have configured LDAP settings on our CMS through the GUI. We've pulled all the users, we've created core spaces. The same thing can be done through by doing API calls to the CMS. That's actually a better way of doing it, because let's say if you had multiple LDAP sources, you cannot do that from the GUI. From the GUI, if you have just one LDAP source and you want to pull users, no problem. But let's say if you had multiple LDAP sources, you cannot define more than one LDAP source through the GUI. In that case, you would want to do an API call to the CMS. So let me quickly show you my Active Directory settings once more, just so that you can capture the configuration or the settings under my field mapping for expressions. So these are all the parameters that I put in, all the fields that I filled out. And in fact, let me just increase the size so you can see it better. These are all my settings, and that's all you need to configure LDAP and pull all the users and create the core spaces.